Society of American Gastrointestinal and Endoscopic Surgeon. She has presented research papers at various international conferences like the International Congress on Emergencies in OPS in 2011 and ACE in 2017. Has various publications to her credit, included a chapter in the Fertility Manual 2019 edition. So I welcome you, Dr. Sabjaya Singh, and now I would like to hand over the mic to you. So please, you can start with your session.
Good afternoon, everybody. I hope all of you are safe, and thank you for joining us for this webinar. Today, as it has been told to you, we will be discussing about the current perspectives in PCO. I would like to introduce myself. I'm Dr. Sabjaya. I am the clinical head at Oasis Fertility in Ranchi. I have tried to make this presentation a little more interesting by using the Q&A form so that it does not become a very monotonous presentation by just going through the slides and a lot of theory. Any questions will be welcomed at the end of the session. And any queries, if any one of you has, you can always reach out to us through emails or through our team after the session. Please let me know in between if there is any interruption in the Wi-Fi, because we have just recovered from a cyclone. So please excuse me if there is a internet problem in between. So I will be starting now. Initially, as just to begin with a little bit of introduction on PCOD, as we all know, it is the most common endocrine disorder that we come across, especially in a fertility clinic. And it is, very, very prevalent, especially in South Asia, in India, especially in the southern part of India, and very, very common in the reproductive age group. It is a prevalent presenting feature of PCOD, infertility, and more than 75% of these women suffer anovulation, making PCO a very, very common problem of infertility, anovulatory infertility mostly. Most of the patients with infertility with PCOD have a problem getting pregnant, which is around 70% of the patients who suffer from PCOD end up having fertility issues. There are about 30% of the people who have PCOD in any form who do not end up with infertility problems and actually do end up conceiving naturally, despite having PCO in terms of they might have PCOD morphology, but they anovulate, they bed, but they ovulate. Could be because of lifestyle changes or whatever, but most of them do need treatment. Coming to a little bit of facts and numbers when it comes to PCOD. As I said, more than 50% of the patients are diagnosed because they end up coming to the clinic, but around 50% of the women are underdiagnosed and they don't even know that they have PCO morphology. And it might be an accidental finding. They don't have any anovulation or any other biochemical problems, but are accidentally diagnosed in ultrasound. 50 to 70% of these women have hirsutism. 5 to 10% of these women are in the reproductive age. 30 to 75% of these women are overweight or obese, and around 50 to 70% have insulin resistance. Coming to a little bit of pathophysiology, not going too much in detail because this can be a little boring. So just as we all know, the normal cyclic pattern of the hormones that go up and down during a natural or normal menstrual cycle does not happen in a PCOD. It is very stagnant. The hormones don't have that, changes in the follicular phase and the luteal phase. There is no ovulation. There is no surge. And basically, if we have to say, a PCOD patient is always forever in the follicular phase. So the hormonal lines are very stagnant and there are no changes throughout the cycles, which ends up in the patient not having periods for months together. We all know this, so not going into too much of detail. There is an interplay of hormones starting from the pituitary at the level of the ovaries, at the level of the liver, the pancreas, the adipose tissue, the skeletal muscle, and finally into the uterus. Most of them acting independently as organs and for the metabolism of these hormones. and eventually ending up in menstrual irregularity because of anovulation and endometrial hyperplasia. Coming into the diagnostic criteria, over the years, we all know NIH first came up with a very, very simple classification in 90, which included only hyperandrogenism and ovulatory dysfunction. ESHRE in 2003 said we have to include PCO morphology as well. Again, in 2006, the PCO Society came up with saying that any of the two criteria can be diagnosed as PCOD. And the most recent NIH in 2012, as an extension of ASRM ESHRE in 2003, said three types: hyperandrogenism, ovulatory dysfunction, morphology. Any two of the three criteria present can be labeled as a PCOD. And they also came up with phenotypical grouping of these groups, which were divided into 4 groups. To be a little more phenotype A, B, C, and D. So what happens in PCOD? It's not just during the reproductive phase that these women end up having problems. They need to be managed throughout their lifetime, including starting from the reproductive period up to the menopausal period, because these women are very, very prone to having metabolic and cardiovascular disorders even later in life, even when they are done with their pregnancy, completed their reproductive functions. They still need intervention. So it has to be a multidisciplinary approach, starting from the pediatric age group, in the adolescent group, up to including the dermatologist when there are issues with the skin, the gynecology when we are dealing with hyperplasia and anovulation, endocrinology when there is a metabolic disorder involved, diabetology when it is converting into frank elevated sugar levels, cardiology, and finally geriatric. Coming to management of PCOD, just briefly, it varies from lifestyle modification to dermatological interventions to menstrual dysfunctions to infertility management and to manage adverse metabolic dysfunctions. Lifestyle modification, first and foremost, we have to ask the patient to maintain an optimal BMI, include exercise, lose some weight if they are exceeding the required weight cutoff. Dermatological interventions could involve occipitals, anti-androgens, cosmetic indications when there is actually a lot of frank hirsutism and which cannot be reversed. It can be prevented, but the damage that has been done has to be done or corrected by using cosmetology. Menstrual dysfunctions can be regulated by using occipitals and progestins. Fertility management can vary from ovulation induction to LOD to IUI, and then finally IVF if nothing works. Manage adverse metabolic dysfunctions can be done by improving insulin sensitivity by using sensitizers, statins, and antioxidants. So coming to lifestyle modification, this is the first and foremost, and a lot of patients actually respond to just lifestyle modification. They might not even require treatment beyond this. So this is a very, very important but often ignored aspect of treatment in PCOD. So the first line of treatment when we see a patient is we have to advise them to incorporate a good diet, exercise into their lifestyle, probably correct any other hormonal issues if they have, whether it's thyroid or prolactin, any associated dysfunction in the blood sugars. They have to be educated about these problems, the problems that can arise later in life, the problems of the benefits of losing weight and exercise, which can actually end up in spontaneous ovulation and spontaneous conceptions. Pharmacological interventions are indicated only in presence of insulin resistance or glucose intolerance or dyslipidemia that persists after lifestyle modification. The first visit, when we diagnose that a patient has PCOD, we have to counsel them about lifestyle modification, whether they go for further treatment or not. We actually end up meeting these patients after 1 or 2 months if they have actually listened to us and they come and tell us that they've conceived naturally and they don't even need any treatment. Coming to interventions that come into play after lifestyle modification, metformin, the most important, we all know. If added with lifestyle modification, lowers a lot of complications like the free androgen index, the deposition of subcutaneous adipose tissue, and weight, and the BMI actually ending up in a reduction of BMI. But we don't know how its effect is on glucose tolerance. Metformin, I'll come up into the benefits of metformin a little later also, so that we have a little more clarity as to where exactly metformin has a role, a beneficial role which is proven, and where there is still a little bit of gray area where we don't know exactly how much helpful it is. Since we're talking about lifestyle modification, it is important for us to know what is the body mass index that is in which bracket, and how much weight does a patient need to lose. So underweight is less than 18.5 BMI, which is also not good, can lead to anovulation and ovulatory dysfunction. A normal BMI is 18.5 to 24.9. Overweight is 25 to 29.9. Obese is more than 30, and extremely obese, morbid obesity beyond 35. I'm talking about the Asian population. The body mass index changes with the nationality and the race. Coming into the evidence that we have for lifestyle modifications in PCOD, the international evidence guidelines that we have in 2018, this is the most recent, which tells us that it should be recommended as a first line, especially with patients with PCO who have excess weight central obesity and proven insulin resistance in their reports. We have to set achievable goals, and realistic goals, and because someone who is a BMI of 35 cannot become a BMI of 25 in a period of 3 to 4 months. So we have to tell the patient what is a realistic goal, how to reach there. Even a 5 to 10% weight loss can be beneficial, and it will give the patient a lot of motivation when they actually realize that their symptoms are reducing. Sometimes ovulation is also restored even with this much weight loss, and they get motivated to lose even more weight in the long run if required. Coming to adolescents, at what point after the onset of menarche and how many years of irregular cycle should we actually label them as menstrual dysfunction, or should we tell them that now you need intervention or testing for PCOD? ESHRE and Endocrine Society both have their criteria for PCOD in adolescents. To summarize, we can wait up to 3 years post menopause, post menarche, but up to 2 years is more than enough. And if they still have ovulatory dysfunction with more than 2 to 3 years, they need intervention, and we will have to find out if they come into the bracket of PCOD and if they require any treatment. When anovulation needs to be confirmed, hormonal assessment if relevant, and PCO is clinically suspected in cycles are regular. Irregular cycles and anovulatory dysfunctions are also a normal component of pubertal and post-menopausal transitions, defining abnormality in these life stages, and they're still very challenging for all of us. As I mentioned, 2 to 3 years can be given for physiological maturation of the HPO axis. So when irregular cycles reflect reproductive maturity and they still persist after 2 to 3 years, they need intervention and treatment. So the same thing that I mentioned, I have evidence for this. And how am I saying what I'm saying is when, the international evidence guidelines in 2018 tells us that it is normal in the first year post-menarche as a part of pubertal transition, irregular cycles. More than 1 year or less than 3 years post-menarche, when the patient is less than 21 or more than 45, we need to intervene. More than 3 years post-menarche to perimenopause, that is less than 21 or more than 35 or less than 8 cycles per year. If it still persists, they need intervention. More than 1 year post-menarche or more than 90 days for any one cycle. Any primary amenorrhea beyond the age of 15 or more than 3 years post-telarche. When irregular menstrual cycles are present, the diagnosis of PCO should be considered and assessed according to the guidelines. In adolescents with irregular menstrual cycles, the value and the optimal timing of assessment and diagnosis of PCO should be discussed with the patient, taking into account the diagnostic challenges at this life stage and psychological and cultural factors. ovulatory dysfunction can still persist even if there is regular cycles. Just because a woman is having regular cycles does not mean she's ovulating and it's an ovulatory cycle. Anovulation can be there with regular cycles. And if there is doubt and the woman is looking at conceiving and we are suspecting anovulatory cycles, the most simplest way is to do a serum progesterone if they are not very inclined into more detailed testing. So coming to another very commonly asked question in women with suspected PCO, what is the most effective measure to diagnose PCO related and biochemical hyperandrogenism? This is still a very gray area. We are still not in the stage where we can say that this is the ideal test or the gold standard tests for diagnosing hyperandrogenism. Although it is a very, very key diagnostic feature of PCO, can affect from 60% to 100% of the people suffering from PCO. But this feature is something which is very, very gray, and there is no exact, laboratory test which can tell us that, which can, draw the line and say this is hyperandrogenism and this is not. The most reliable of whatever we have is the calculated free testosterone, free androgen index, calculated bioavailable testosterone. Direct free testosterone assay and radiometric such as ELISA preferably should not be used in the assessment of hyperandrogenism in PCO, as they demonstrate poor sensitivity, accuracy, and precision. Where the assessment of biochemical hyperandrogenism is important in women on hormonal conception, drug withdrawal is recommended for 3 months or longer before the measurement, and conception management with non-hormonal alternative is needed during this time. It is very, very important to follow this, because if we do the androgen estimation when the patient is on any sort of a hormonal therapy, it is not going to give us the right results. Anyway, we don't have the most ideal test for this, and doing tests with hormonal intervention is not going to benefit either the patient or us. The assessment of biochemical hyperandrogenism is most useful in establishing the diagnosis of PCO and the phenotype where the clinical signs of hyperandrogenism is unclear or absent. Where we are very clear and there are signs of hyperandrogenism, physical signs of hyperandrogenism, we don't really have to worry. But the trouble arises where we are, suspecting something and cannot definitively say that, hyperandrogenism is there. There is where we, lag behind a little bit with lab testing. What is the ultrasound indicated? When is ultrasound indicated to diagnose PCO? And what is the most effective ultrasound criteria to diagnose PCO? This is very, very common. Most of us know what are the most recent criteria for diagnosing of PCO, but there is still some places where, there is indiscriminate or over-diagnosis of PCOD. So it is very important for us to know what are the most recent guidelines and what exactly are the ultrasound findings. Obviously, transvaginal scan is the most sensitive. And we cannot rely on the, Rotterdam criteria of more than 12 follicles anymore, because we have to remember that this criteria was way back in 2003, where the ultrasound machines were not as sophisticated as we have them today. So the criteria and the diagnostic criteria have changed with the kind of magnification that we have and the sophisticated ultrasound machinery that we have. This criteria has changed. Volume, yes, more than 10 cc. But the criteria of follicles has changed from more than 10 or 12 to 26 right now. I am quoting this study of 2013. It's a human reproduction study. It was a diagnostic study where they had studied around more than 3,000 patients, and the ovarian the volume and the number of follicles were studied, and it was later seen as how many of them were actually PCOD. So the diagnostic potential for PCO was highest with the follicular number per ovary by follicular number per square and ovarian volume as judged by the area under ROC curve. So the most significant and the most relevant was the follicular number per ovary, where they concluded in this study that it should be more than 26 follicles per ovary. Is anti-Mullerian hormone effective for diagnosis of PCOD? Is AMH effective for diagnosis of PCO morphology? And is AMH a predictor of OHSs? AMH, although not a novel testing anymore, it's been a long time that it has been there and it is being used. But there are still, interpretations from AMH that we are getting to know. Right now, the most recent, we all know AMH is increased in, it tells us about the ovarian reserve, very, very important tool in ovarian reserve testing. It's a good tool in telling us if we can expect hyperstimulation in PCO patients. It is actually, under a study, and a lot of studies are saying that it can actually predict live birth also now. So we are learning a lot of new things about AMH with every passing day, and as more and more studies are done. The only problem with AMH is the standardization of the test, and the data that we have is, of different ways of AMH testing. So once that is streamlined, I think AMH can actually give us a lot more information that what it does right now. Serum AMH levels are significantly higher in women with PCO compared to normal ovulatory women. We all know this. Strong correlations have been demonstrated between circulating AMH levels and AFC on ultrasound in PCO. AMH may also provide insight into the pathogenesis of PCO and the different phenotypes. However, current literature reveals significant heterogeneity, and diagnostic value of serum AMH remains far from clear. So as I said, there are various ways of AMH testing. There needs to be a little bit more of standardization. The more homogeneous studies, as in where studies where we include the same type of AMH testing and then probably come into a conclusion, and not use different diagnostic ways of testing AMH and then incorporating all of that into telling us what AMH is capable.
Hello. Hello, Razi, am I audible?
Yes, you are audible.
Then I believe there is a connectivity issue at Dr. Z.
Yes. Yeah.
Am I audible? Komal?
Yes, doctor, you are audible.
Yes, doctor, you're audible.
I'm very sorry. As I mentioned, after effects of the cyclone, so please excuse me. Yeah, so we were talking about the AMH. Sorry for the interruption. So serum AMH level should not be used as an alternative for the detection of PCO, as a single diagnostic test of PCO. We have to use it as an adjuvant, not as an alternative for the diagnosis of PCO. There is emerging evidence that with improved standardization of assays and established cutoff levels of threshold, based on a large-scale validation, AMH may become more accurate in the detection of PCO. As of now, it is not very, very sensitive. Fair evidence that in PCO AMH values are increased, peak estradiol levels, multifollicular growth development, and high number of oocytes are retrieved where the AMH levels are higher. While the cutoff points require validation, AMH value of more than 3.4, this is an ASRM 2016 study that I'm quoting, says where the AMH is more than 3.4, AFC is more than 24, and the optimum follicles developed are more than 25, estradiol values being more than 3,500. More than 2.24 oocytes retrieved, particularly associated with an increased risk of OHSs. So obviously AMH and AFC are the only two things that we can see before starting stimulation. So we have to be cautious in these patients before we start stimulation.
Excuse me, doctor. You can share your slides. I think slides are not visible.
I'm sorry. You couldn't see my previous slide?
Only this one after we rejoined. I mean, after we reconnected.
Doctor, now your slides are not visible.
After
Is
we
it visible
reconnected.
now? Visible
No.
now?
No.
1 second. Visible now?
Yes, doctor. Now they are visible.
I'm sorry. So yes, as I mentioned, the AMH values when more than 3.4 and an AFC of more than 24, we can anticipate OHSs. So women with PCO should women with PCO undergo preconceptional evaluation for risk factors that may adversely affect fertility and response to fertility therapy? Should women with PCO with or without infertility undergo preconceptional evaluation for risk factors that may lead to adverse pregnancy outcomes? And should women with PCO undergo close pregnancy monitoring for adverse pregnancy outcomes? Factors such as blood glucose, weight, blood pressure, smoking, alcohol, diet, exercise, sleep, and mental, emotional, and sexual health needs to be optimized in women with PCO to improve reproductive and obstetric outcomes aligned with recommendations in general population. Monitoring during pregnancy is important in women with PCO, given increased risk of adverse maternal and offspring complications. It is a confounding factor. We have to be more cautious. Making PCO patients pregnant is easy, but the antenatal course has to be monitored with a lot of vigilance. It is proven beyond doubt that they are slightly at a higher risk of, increased perinatal and antenatal complication. Coming to the next common question is the combined ocipil alone or in combination with effective for management of hormonal and clinical PCO features in adolescents and in adults with PCO? The COCP alone should be recommended in adult women with PCO for the management of hyperandrogenism and or irregular cycles, not otherwise. COCP alone should be considered in adolescents where a clear diagnosis of PCO for management of clinical hyperandrogenism or irregular menstrual cycles. The COCP should be considered in adolescents who are deemed at risk but not yet diagnosed with PCO for the management of clinical hyperandrogenism and irregular menstrual cycles. So when we are using the COCP pills, we have to ensure that we use low dose and lowest dose of effective estrogen therapy that we have, which is around 20 to 30 micrograms of ethinyl estradiol, which is more to of a natural estrogen preparation and with very limited side effects. We have to ensure that PCO specific risk factors such as high BMI, hyperlipidemia, and hypertension has to be considered when we are giving COCP treatments, even in the adolescent group. So it has to be very guided for a limited time, complemented with lifestyle and other adjuvant therapies. Because we have to realize that giving COCP is not the be all and end all and cannot be done for the longest time. It is only a very temporary solution, but has to be, it is not the cure for PCOD as such. In the combination with COCP, metformin should be considered, where especially when there is defined metabolic features, when the weight is more than 20, when the BMI is more than 25. Metformin may be cost beneficial, especially in high metabolic groups, risk groups, where the patient is at risk of diabetes, impaired glucose tolerance, or in high ethnic groups. And anti-androgens, when given, can be given in some patients where absolutely required. But when we are giving it, we have to ensure that it has to be done with effective contraception so that there is no, virilization of the female fetus. Have to ensure that we tell them to maintain contraception for however long it is being given, and to avoid these very simple basic complications. So what is the principles of ovulation induction in PCO? What are the most recent guidelines that we have here? Pregnancy needs to be excluded before we start ovulation induction. Very, very common, but we cannot just presume that if a woman is not getting a period, she is, we have to at least for theoretically do a pregnancy test before we do any intervention in this group. Unsuccessful prolonged use of ovulation induction agents needs to be avoided. because it has poor success rates and still a gray line there where they cause borderline ovarian tumors in the future. And we have to avoid hyperstimulation. These are the basic guidelines that we need to follow before we start ovulation induction or any sort of stimulation in a PCO patient. The next question is, in a woman with PCO, are aromatase inhibitors effective for improving fertility outcomes? Yes, letrose is still the most effective and the first line pharmacological treatment which is preferred for ovulation induction in women with PCO and anovulatory infertility, where there is no other infertility factor which is present. Where letrose is not available or is not permitted to use, which is most of the places it is now, health professionals can use other ovulation induction agents, but it is always the first line. Health professionals and women need to be aware with the risk of multiple pregnancies much lower with letrose compared to CC. So in women with PCO, is clomiphene effective for improving fertility outcomes? Is metformin effective for improving fertility outcomes? In women with PCO, where the BMI is more than 30, what is the effectiveness of metformin compared to clomiphene citrate for improving fertility outcomes? A lot of studies here, RCTs, meta-analysis, all of them, the evidence still bending a little bit towards letrose, saying it is superior to CC, especially in PCO patients. The multifollicular growth is much lower in letrose. The live birth rate is much higher in letrose. The endometrial complications are much lower in letrose. So it is this. These are the reasons why it is still the first line and probably always will be when compared to CC. Clomiphene citrate should be used alone or considered in women with PCO with anovulatory infertility and no other infertility factor to improve ovulation and pregnancy rate. Metformin could be used alone in women with PCO with anovulatory infertility and no other infertility factors to improve ovulation, pregnancy, and live birth rates. Although women should be informed that there are more effective ovulation induction agents like letrose. Clomiphene citrate should be used in preference when considering CC or metformin for ovulation induction in women with PCO who are obese, where the BMI is more than 30. If metformin is being used for ovulation induction in PCO with anovulatory infertility, no other infertility factors, CC could be added to improve ovulation, pregnancy, and live birth rate. We have to understand that metformin is again not an ovulation induction agent. It does not increase, spontaneous ovulation rates. The only proven role of metformin in PCO right now is, apart from glucose tolerance, is that it reduces the risk of OHSs, especially when we are using agents like CC. So it can be combined, but there is no other proven benefit of using metformin in ovulation induction. The risk of multiple pregnancies increase with CC, and therefore monitoring needs to be considered. In women with PCO and are gonadotrophins effective for improving fertility outcomes? What is the role of gonadotrophins? I think MCure people will be very happy with this slide that we are presenting. Gonadotrophin could be used as second line of pharmacological agents in women with PCO, especially where they have failed in the first line of oral ovulation induction therapy. We should not hesitate in using gonadotrophins and not be scared of using them even in ovulation induction. HMG is a good option because it is cheaper compared to FSH. Can be used as along with oral agents, where oral agents have not ended up in giving us a dominant follicle in a PCO patient, and if otherwise maybe two. So we should not be scared of hyperstimulation, because if they're done or given under monitoring every alternate day, they don't end up in hyperstimulation. Can be given in low doses like 75 or 150 depending on the weight of the patient. Gonadotrophins with the addition of metformin could be used rather than gonadotrophin alone in women with PCO with anovulatory infertility. As I mentioned, the reason behind this would be to reduce the risk of hyperstimulation. If any one of you are scared of using gonadotrophin alone, can use metformin as an adjuvant to prevent hyperstimulation. When we are giving a patient gonadotrophins for stimulation, we have to tell them about the cost and the availability. We have to ensure that the clinic has expertise The clinician has the expertise to convert it into an IVF cycle if required. We have to tell them the the degree of intensive ultrasound monitoring that will be required in these patients. We have to counsel them about the risk of potential multiple pregnancy, and most of the times low dose gonadotropin therapy you end up even in monofollicular development. So as I said, just giving oral agents and then not monitoring the patient and directly asking them to try and giving progesterone in the luteal phase is not going to help. If we are doing an ovulation induction, it has to be done and ensured that the woman is ovulated, which cannot be done if we don't monitor them. So regular monitoring, we normally do it after the 7th day of oral agent, and then give them a dose or two of gonadotropins if required, and probably repeat it until it reaches dominance, which is around 14 to 15 millimeter. And then after, once it is dominant, then we don't need to give, and we can just monitor and probably give a trigger. What does Cochrane say? The review in 2019 says that there may be little or no difference in live birth, multiple pregnancy, clinical pregnancy, or miscarriage rate between urinary derived gonadotropins and recombinant FSH. It is uncertain whether HMG or urinary FSH improves pregnancy outcomes in women with PCO. It is uncertain whether the interventions decrease the incidence of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome. When compared to continued treatment with CC, gonadotropin resulted in more live births without increasing the rate of multiple pregnancies. Gonadotropin resulted in more clinical pregnancies, but also in more miscarriages than clomiphene, while there were no cases of OHSs. The reason behind more miscarriages in gonadotropin is inadequate luteal support, because and if that is given, I think that is the only bias when it comes to gonadotropin. Otherwise, there is no other theoretical explanation as to why someone with gonadotropin would end up having a miscarriage. The next common question is, in women with PCO, is ovarian surgery effective for improving fertility outcome? A lot of us must be seeing patients in our clinics who have come to us after ovarian drilling, sometimes even two, which I believe is quite, we have actually seen patients going from PCO to a poor ovarian reserve because of excessive ovarian drilling. So we have to be very, very careful when we are doing this for patients. Do they actually require? Is it actually going to be benefit? And are we actually doing it in the right amount, or are we harming the patient? The guidelines in 2018 say LOD could be a second line of therapy for women in PCO who are clomiphene citrate resistant with anovulatory infertility and no other infertility factor. So we have to do it only for CC resistant patients. LOD could be potentially offered as a first line of treatment only if laparoscopy is indicated for any other reason in women with PCO with anovulatory infertility and no other infertility factors. So if there is any other reason and we have introduced a scope and we see that the ovaries are very bulky, we can do the ovarian drilling, which we have to follow the rule of 4. But it is never the first line of treatment otherwise. Risk should be explained to all women with PCO considering involving the laparoscopic surgery. We have to consider the cost versus benefit when we are doing a surgery. The intraoperative and the post-operative risks that are involved, especially when the woman is obese. And as I mentioned, there is a small associated risk of lower ovarian reserve or loss of ovarian function if the drilling is excessive or repeated. And there is periadnexal adhesion formation, which could be an associated risk factor. So who requires ovarian surgery? That decision is very, very important. And just doing an ovarian surgery cannot actually give us results. Only if we're doing it for block tubes or any other reason when we're actually introducing a scope, but never the first line. Again, Cochrane also in 2020 says that very low quality evidence shows that LOD with or without medical ovulation induction may decrease the live birth rate slightly in women with anovulatory PCO and CC resistance compared with medical ovulation induction alone. Evidence suggests that if the chance of live birth rate following medical ovulation induction alone is 44%, the chance following LOD would be 32 to 52%. Moderate quality evidence shows that LOD probably reduces the number of multiple pregnancies. There may be little or no difference between the treatments for clinical pregnancy, and there is uncertainty about the effect of LOD compared with ovulation induction alone on miscarriage. Ovulation hyperstimulation may occur less often following LOD. The quality of evidence is not sufficient to justify a conclusion on live birth, clinical pregnancy, or miscarriage for the analysis of unilateral LOD versus bilateral LOD. The next question is, in women with PCO, is stimulated IVF-ICSI effective for improving fertility outcomes? In the absence of absolute indication of IVF-ICSI, women with PCO and anovulatory infertility could be offered IVF as a third line therapy, where the first line and the second line have failed. In women with anovulatory PCO, the use of IVF is effective when elective single embryo transfer is used. Multiple pregnancies can be minimized by this technique. Women with PCO undergoing IVF-ICSI need to be counseled prior to starting the therapy about the availability, the cost, the convenience, the increased risk of OHSs, and the options to reduce the risk of OHSs, which could be mild stimulation and freeze-all cycle. In women with PCO undergoing IVF-ICSI treatment, is the ANTAC protocol or agonist long protocol the most effective for improving fertility outcomes? This is not any rocket science. We all know that agonist is more effective than ANTAC, more effective in reducing OHSs, more safe, especially in outpatient clinics. HCG is best used at the lowest doses to trigger final oocyte maturation and to reduce the incidence of OHSs. We can, with an agonist, if you are, agonist trigger in an ANTAC cycle, if you're really, thinking or anticipating low yield of M2s, we can, add HCG as an adjuvant. The dose can vary from 1500 to 5000, depending on how many follicles we have, as a dual trigger or as an adjuvant to ANTAC. Triggering final maturation with gonadotropin agonist and freezing all suitable embryos could be considered in women with PCO, having an IVF-ICSI cycle with antagonist protocol and an increased risk of developing OHSs. In IVF-ICSI cycles in women with PCO, consideration needs to be given to an elective freeze-all of all embryos. So we have in a good lab where there is option of freeze-all, definitely should be given a thought. An HCG trigger, a little bit of HCG trigger can be given if you are actually planning to do a fresh transfer. That can take care of the luteolytic effect that an agonist trigger has. But the safest is to go with an agonist trigger, ANTAC protocol, agonist trigger, and freeze-all to prevent OHSs, and probably have an OHSs free clinic if we actually follow this protocol. What about OHSs? The pre-treatment and the prevention of OHSs, what are the most recent guidelines? There is ASRM in 2016 says, good evidence to support the use of ANTAC to reduce the risk of OHSs, insufficient evidence that CC independently reduces OHSs, fair evidence that aspirin reduces the risk of OHSs, good evidence that metformin decreases the risk of OHSs, insufficient evidence when it comes to coasting, insufficient evidence when it is recommended a lower dose of HCG to trigger oocyte maturation or for the reduction of OHS's risk based on just one underpowered RCT. There is good evidence to recommend the use of GnRH ANTAC to trigger oocyte maturation prior to oocyte retrieval. Good evidence that live birth rates are lower in fresh cycles after GnRH trigger, but not donor recipient cycles. Fair evidence that reproductive outcomes are improved when low dose HCG is co-administered, as I was mentioning in the last slide. So, to take care of the luteal support. Good evidence that dopamine agonist administration reduces the incidence of OHSs. So after pickup, we can give them an dopamine agonist dose for up to 7 to 10 days, depending on the E2 values and the number of follicles that we aspirate. Insufficient evidence to conclusively state that albumin lowers the risk of OHSs. Calcium, fair evidence that it reduces the OHSs. Fair evidence that cryopreservation prevents OHSs. There is no doubt about it. Fair evidence to recommend paracentesis or cardocentesis for the management of OHSs in an outpatient setting. Insufficient evidence to support the use of volume expanders as of now. Again, Cochrane, not very different than from the ASRM article, Metformin before AIT cycle, they recommend, they say it's moderate quality. GnRH ANTAG protocol say moderate quality to reduce OHSs. ANTAG to trigger moderate quality again. Evidence of low or very low quality is for CC, cabergoline, plasma expanders, and progesterone luteal support. They say these are all low quality, but moderate quality is for metformin, ANTAG, and agonist trigger. So in women with PCO, how beneficial is IVM? Where are we with IVM right now? As we all know, I'm not going too much into detail. We all know IVM is the in vitro maturation. The only proven indications right now is severe PCOD, previous history of ovarian hyperstimulation syndrome, cases where the use of excessive ovarian stimulation is contraindicated, like hormone-dependent tumors, or patients who have less time going for chemo, radiotherapy, cancer patients, multiple failed IVF cycles because of poor oocyte quality. We can try IVM. IVM has, to a certain extent, advantages over IVF in some patients, where we all know that it is more cost-effective. It is more convenient, more patient compliant, because the hospital visits are lesser. The doses that of injection that have to be taken are lesser, and the emotional side effects and other side effects are much lower. There are no RCTs of IVM versus ICSI for ovulation induction in PCO. However, observational studies suggest that offspring from IVM are not adversely effective. So there is no perinatal outcome which is detrimental, and we don't have any studies that say IVM is detrimental. Where centers which have good or sufficient expertise, IVM can be offered or should be considered without the, to decrease the risk of OHSs. As I said, at OSS we do a lot of IVM, especially recommended when they've had previous history of hyperstimulation. We even do it for patients who have poor ovarian reserve. We have done it for patients who have going for cancer therapies, before chemo and radio. We do it for donors sometimes, where they have, we are trying to reduce cost. The only problem and the reason why IVM has not become so popular as compared to IVF is because of the live birth rate. There is otherwise reaching to a stage of blastocyst, IVM is in nowhere inferior to IVF. If you have a good lab setting, if you have a good embryologist, and if you have the expertise to do an IVM aspiration, because it is slightly technically more difficult than doing a normal oocyte pickup. What does Cochrane say about IVM? Although promising data on IVM technique have been published, there is no evidence concerning primary outcomes of live birth and miscarriage rates from properly conducted RCTs. Of the secondary outcomes specified in this review, very low quality evidence showed that clinical pregnancy was higher when IVM was compared to conventional ART, whereas the incidence of ovarian hyperstimulation was 0. Obviously, it is much lesser in IVM. And if we do a freeze-all cycle, the live birth rate should be no different than IVF. So if you have the expertise to do a freeze-all, do an IVM, and then do an FET, and there should be no issues with receptivity, and hence it will end up giving the same live birth rate as, or clinical pregnancy rate as an IVF cycle. Coming to adjuvants, where are we with adjuvants right now? There is a large number of adjuvants that we have to our disposal when it comes to PCOD. The market is filled with all sorts of statins, resveratrol, metformins. They say that they have role in increasing the IGF, control dyslipidemia, inflammation, endothelial dysfunction at the level of the CVS, the ovary, and a lot of things. But what is the evidence? Where do we stand? What actually out of them is beneficial, and what is still observational or experimental? I'll come to them one by one. Is ionositol alone or in combination with other therapies effective for management of hormonal and clinical PCO features? What is the evidence when it comes to just ionositol? The guideline says ionositol should currently be considered only experimental in PCO. And with the emerging evidence on efficacy highlighting the need for further research, women taking inositol and other complementary therapies are encouraged to advise their health professional. And just taking inositol is not going to cure the PCOD or cure the infertility that they are. So basically, bottom line, they're still experimental. Cochrane, the opinion is not very different. They also say that the evidence which we have is very low quality, and we are still uncertain where inositol improves live birth rate or clinical pregnancy rate. It is uncertain whether it decreases the miscarriage rate or multiple pregnancy rate. No pooled evidence is available for the use of MI versus placebo or any other antioxidant. So again, not very different from the last study, experimental. Coming to the adjuvants that I'll be talking about, metformin, I think we've already covered. Statins, resveratrol and melatonin. These are the doses, the hormonal effects that they claim to have, the metabolic effects, and what are the doses that they commonly used in. So we have a very elegant meta-analysis in 2020, which compared the efficacy of statins, metformin, spironolactone, and combined nocicepals in reducing testosterone level in women. They included 9 RCTs and showed that atorvastatin showed greater reduction in testosterone level compared to COC, spironolactone plus metformin, simvastatin, spironolactone, simvastatin plus metformin, and lifestyle modification and placebo. So various combinations and permutations, and they concluded that atorvastatin was, most potent in reducing testosterone levels. We don't have a lot of meta-analysis, so we still don't know which one, but this is the one that is the latest, and this is what they say. In women with PCO undergoing COS for IVF-ICSI, is adjuvant metformin effective for improving fertility outcomes? 6 RCTs that were studied and found that in IVF with adjuvant metformin was better for OHSs, clinical pregnancy rate, and cancellation rate, and live birth rate. No statistically significant differences are found between the groups for the amount of gonadotropin used, the duration, the miscarriage, and the number of oocyte collected, and the number of pregnancy rate. A Cochrane review in 2014 noted that there was no evidence of a difference with adjuvant metformin for live birth rate, miscarriage rate, number of oocytes collected, the duration of stimulation, cancellation, but OHSs definitely was reduced. So proven benefit again with metformin, take home message, metformin reduces OHSs. Some studies say live birth rate, but we don't know. In women with PCO, are anti-obesity pharmacological agents effective for improving fertility outcomes? Lariglutide is one of the most recent drugs that we use. It's a glucagon-like peptide receptor 1 agonist approved for treating type 2 diabetes and obesity. It is used for diabetes, has been used in obese women with PCO. Liraglutide was effective to induce significant weight loss and reduce waist circumference. Orlistat, again, a lipase inhibitor labeled for treatment for obesity. In overweight or obese women with PCO, orlistat was found to be effective to induce weight loss and improve clinical and biochemical markers for hyperandrogenism and insulin resistance. So, orlistat and liraglutide can be used for weight loss. With inadequate evidence in both PCO and infertility, generally the risk versus benefit ratio is currently too uncertain to advocate anti-obesity pharmacological agents as a fertility treatment. It should remain as an experimental treatment for this indication. Obviously, it is going to help us, reduce the dose of gonadotrophins if it ends up in weight loss, but not definitely as a first-line treatment in fertility. Coming to another very common adjuvant, which is vitamin D. We all know it has a role in increasing blastulation rates where supplemented in infertility people, in the infertility population. But especially in PCOD, what role does it have? Meta-analysis in 2020, this is a Chinese meta-analysis, which says that the data from the available RCTs suggested that vitamin D supplementation reduced insulin resistance and hyperandrogenism, as well as improved the lipid metabolism of patients with PCOD to an extent. Further, high-quality RCTs from a variety of regions in the world is required to prove this. But definitely supplementation should be done, and as it has benefits otherwise also in an infertility population, especially if it is suboptimal. So to the assessment and treatment of infertility in PCO, just to summarize exactly where we are, as I started, first line of non-pharmacological management is lifestyle modification. First line of pharmacological would be letrozole. First line therapy, CC. Second, CC plus metformin. Metformin alone, not very helpful. And finally, gonadotrophins. Second line of pharmacological treatment management would be gonadotrophins plus minus LOD. And the third line obviously is IVF. So this is where we are when it comes to treatment. I think I am done and I'm open if there are any questions.
Okay, doctor. So we have one question from Dr. Suhasti. What's the ideal treatment? Myoinositol, plain or with combination?
So Asni, as I just mentioned, myoinositol is still very, very experimental. If used, definitely has to be used in combination because it is not going to help us, make the patient conceive. So myoinositol, if at all, if it has to be used with ovulation induction in the PCO group. There is no benefit of giving just myoinositol alone. Have I answered your question? Komal, am I audible?
Yes, doctor, you're audible. So, Dr. Awasthi, I have just made you co-host. So, I believe that you have answered the question. So, any other question if anyone is having? Otherwise, we can wrap up the session. So, doctor, as we don't have any other question, we can just wrap up the session.
Thank you, everybody. Thank you, Emcure, for organizing this with us, and thank you all of you for your patient hearing. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, doctor. Pleasure is all ours, and looking forward to a lot of series in the future. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you.
Yeah, I'll just end.